Hello, everyone, and welcome to our EcoCharla with EcoMadres. My name is Karin Stein, and I'm Iowa field organizer with Moms Clean Air Force and its Latino engagement program, EcoMadres. And I'm joined today by a very, very special guest, Monica Ramirez. Monica is an attorney, an author, and an activist. She is the founder of Justice for Migrant Women and co-founder of Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, the Latinx House, and Poderistas. Monica has received numerous recognitions, including the Harvard Kennedy School's Art Gender Equity Changemakers Award, Forbes Mexico's 100 Most Powerful Women's 2018 list, Time Magazine's Time 100 Next list, Most Powerful Latinas list for 2024, and so much more. Monica lives in Ohio with her husband and son. Mónica, bienvenida a nuestra EcoCharla. Welcome to our climate chat with EcoMadres.
Pues muchas gracias. Qué honor. I'm so happy to be here. And just thank you for all of your important and hard work, Karin.
Goes both ways. Thank you, too. So let's talk about your background. Tell us about your upbringing with a farm worker family, and what are some of the earliest memories of caring for the natural environment?
I'm very fortunate to be from the community that I come from. People in this country, when they think about farm workers, if they think about farm workers at all, it's often with this lens of poverty and struggle. And certainly that is the history of farm workers in this nation. There's certainly been a lot of struggle, great struggle. And for the 2 to 3 million farm workers in our country, there are still many major issues like, being paid, not more than $20,000 to $25,000 a year on average, and being exposed to pesticides and all of these things. And my family migrated from Mexico, and for generations worked in the field. I like to say that my family crisscrossed this country, picking, packing, and planting the fruits and vegetables that we eat. And eventually they settled out in Ohio, both my mom's side of the family and my dad's side of the family. And so I'm actually the first generation in my family that did not migrate for the purposes of work. For those of you who are familiar with the farm worker community, breaking the farm worker cycle of migration is actually quite difficult. And thanks to two different farmers, a farmer that helped my mom's side of the family, a farmer that helped my dad's side of the family, my family was eventually able to break that cycle. And I, along with my siblings, were able to grow up in Ohio, live in one place year round, go to school, from kindergarten on up, and had a very much of a different experience than certainly than my parents. My father started working in the fields picking cotton when he was 8. My mother started working in the fields picking cherries when she was 5. So my upbringing is very different. But one of the things that was cornerstone to that upbringing was that my parents never let us forget where we come from. I live in a farm worker community, a place where there's an influx of farm workers every summer. And at one point in time, the place where I'm from, this county where I'm from, it had the largest concentration of farm workers in the state of Ohio that would come every summer to pick tomatoes and cucumbers and other things, just like my family. And, I am so grateful to my parents, because being poor and living that experience of migration, those were never things that my parents felt were detriments. They were never things they felt like we needed to be ashamed of or not talk about. It was quite the contrary. Those were sources of power, and those are the way that we've been able to show our resilience and been able to show how we were, my family, my grandparents, parents, and others were strong enough to be able to surpass those conditions to create a different life for myself and my siblings and cousins. But along the way, they said, this hasn't been an easy journey, and you have a responsibility to give back. You have a responsibility to do something to make things better, because the conditions that my parents and grandparents and great grandparents experienced in the fields over years are still the conditions that farm workers are experiencing today. And so, just have a lot of gratitude for my parents and my grandparents for making sure that we understand the reality of farm workers in this nation, and that we also understood that it was our job to do something to try to make things better.
Yeah. Yeah, I could certainly see that the relationship in your generation, and so important to not lose the vision of the family's journey as you go forward. Let's talk a little bit about the connection between workplace and climate and environment. Your mission is to push for safe and equitable workplaces for rural farm worker women. Have you seen this effort intersect with environmental injustices and climate change? How do those two connect in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, your first question you asked me sort of what was the connection to the land. And I think that farm workers across our country, while we understand that the work that's being done is so important to feed the world, we also understand that in a certain way, farm workers are among those who are stewards of the land, the caretakers, right? Like they're every day are doing the work to create nutritious fruits and vegetables that we consume. But it's also about el cuidado, right? That taking care of the soil and the earth, and it's a very sacred, and I worked in the fields when I was 19 years old, and I remember kind of the vastness of the fields around me, and kind of this like it's like almost a holy experience in some ways,
Yes.
right? And I think farm workers across the world understand that, the importance of that and that stewardship. I think that in terms of the injustices, as I mentioned, farm workers experience a lot of injustices in this country and globally. um, and one of the issues I've worked on my entire career is sexual violence against farm worker women, which is a rampant problem, has been a rampant problem for too long. And I often, when I think about climate, environment, I think that this is Mother Earth. And just as migrant women are experiencing sexual violence and violence at high rates, Mother Earth is experiencing great violence, and so there is like this natural connection to the thinking about like how is the land being treated, what are, you think about the harmful chemicals that are being used and making farm workers and people sick, even the people who live in the surrounding area, sometimes the consumers. There have been these pesticides that have been outlawed because they make people sick, people get cancer, but we're putting that same toxic substance into the ground, into the earth, into our water. And so, there is a natural connection between the exploitation of land and the exploitation of people. And I think that there's now a greater awareness around that. I think that things are certainly heightened with everything happening with climate change. Like, this, if you think about, in January, this, as we started the new year, the world felt like it was on fire because of all the social issues, and the world is literally has been on fire in California with the with the wildfires. And with those fires happening, the workers continue to work, the farm workers are continuing to pick, the other essential workers are doing their jobs. And so, there's so much to be done to protect and defend our earth, and there's so much to be done to address and try to undo or stave off the harms of climate change, because certainly a lot of harm has already been done related to climate and climate change, but we still have an opportunity to make change, and we should be working towards that. Um, but along the same lines, there's also this new reality, which is for the longest time, people migrated for work. They migrated because of poverty. In the case of women, they migrated often to escape violence, gender-based violence. And now there are so many people around the world who are migrating because of climate disasters. And so in my mind, there's a natural connection across all the work that we do in terms of addressing gender-based violence, fighting against exploitation, thinking about the role of preservation and stewardship, and also this new reality that these climate disasters are going to continue. There are going to be people who are going to be forced to migrate because of the climate disasters. People don't think about, they have a very narrow vision of what migration is. People think of it country to country. But if you really stop to think about it, the people who were evacuated and forced to move in California because of the wildfires, or if you look at Oregon or the other states where these wildfires have happened over the years, that is forced migration. They're being
Right.
forced to move. But in our society, people don't think of migration in that way. And so I think like we've got to get more sophisticated in the way that we are thinking about things like climate change and everyone that it impacts, and also thinking about migration and everyone that it impacts. And that's the work that we do. I hope that's the work that we're doing to try to better educate people in the public about the issues that exist and also the changing circumstances.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate your focus on the interconnectedness of things. At my age, 63, there is a perspective that comes simply from age, but also I have migrated. In my case, it was, well, one was not voluntary, but I consider myself a South American girl, a Central American teenager, and a North American adult. And over 63 years, I have a picture of migration, of climate change in all three places at the same time. It is so important to have that picture, and your organization, your work does that, even for people who don't have the perspective of age. And speaking of interconnectedness, let's talk a little bit about mental health, because that is closely tied to the work that you do and to the work that we do at EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force. Several initiatives at Justice for Migrant Women focus on supporting mental health and well-being for farm worker women. You alluded to sexual violence, but there are other forms of violence, as you say, to the earth. How do you see environmental challenges affecting the mental health of the people that you work with? And what protections do you think are most needed?
Mental health is something that I think affects all of us in different ways, right? There are different stressors that we face as humans every day in our lives, whether that be like the race to pick up our children after school or to drop them off on time, or, or to make sure that we have enough food in our cupboards. Like there's just a lot of stressors that people are experiencing every day. When it comes to the work and the working people that we serve, those stressors are myriad, and they are, it's not just one thing they're worried about, right? They're not just worried about drop off. They're worried about like how their kids are going to get to school and stay in school. Are they going to get paid at work today? Are they going to be sexually harassed at work today? Are they going to be forcibly moved from one place to another? Like that's not, most people in their lives might never think of some of those things ever happening. But the people we serve, it's like daily, those are kind of the stressors that they're experiencing. And so we have really tried hard to, one, address the taboo around all things related to mental health, because people don't like to talk about mental health. For a long time, people felt like it was something you shouldn't talk about. It wasn't real medicine even. People didn't understand that mental health was just as important as physical health. And so we've been trying to sort of unravel and unwind that existing taboo, especially with the immigrant community members who we serve, who have been told their entire lives as they've been trying to make it in this world that they need to be strong, they need to put up with it, they need to sacrifice, etc. So that's been part of the work. The other part is the actual direct care. And
That's a problem in many migrant communities. It's just simple access in so many ways.
there isn't enough access. There are not enough therapists in this country who can provide therapy or who will provide therapy, especially at a rate that is affordable to people who make $20,000 a year, right? And the clinics that offer therapy, they are booked, so it's very difficult to get an appointment. But all said, like I think that our work, like creating the Healing Voices Project, which is a mental health project, it's a group therapy project that we created and piloted in California and Florida, two of the places that are being affected because of climate and some of these climate disasters. That's been a very important project. And we're looking to expand it. But I think that as we're expanding like the reach of it, like where it actually is available to provide people with care, which we're expanding to Ohio and Colorado this year with that project. It's also about expanding, like, how are we talking about trauma? What are the traumas? What are the stressors? Which is why I so appreciate this conversation around climate, because we cannot divorce the conversation around climate and climate change and climate disasters from some of the other harms that people are experiencing. There are people in our nation today who were farmers y campesinos, campesinas in Guatemala, who were forced to leave their country because of mudslides. They then
Yes.
experienced the migration journey to the United States, and in that journey experienced trauma, along the way. So the having to leave their country, having to leave their loved ones, experiencing the trauma of migration, coming to this country, having other traumas that they've experienced at work and other places. It's all connected, as you said earlier, but we aren't talking about it in that way. So as we're expanding the footprint of projects like Healing Voices to geographic locations, my hope is that we also expand kind of the substance that is covered, because when Healing Voices was created, it was created during COVID, and that was a very particular reality that we were addressing. But I think that taking on topics like climate change, climate disasters, the trauma related to climate, forced movement, etc. Like those are topics that we have got to be introducing to the community, socializing to people, helping to draw the connections and connect the dots, and then really
Mhm.
thinking about like what is the kind of care that people need in the face of those kinds of disasters.
Yeah, I think the word trauma here is key. The world is profoundly traumatized, and to take action through a trauma enforced lens is maybe the only way in which we can support communities and not fall into the repetition of patterns from one generation to another, even in the face of a constantly changing climate. If we can be aware of trauma, how that manifests, and how to manage it, that is fundamentally important. And I think your organization is so crucial in that respect. Let's you addressed earlier the relationship between migration and climate. Let's talk a little bit about what other organizations can do. So, as an environmental organization advocating for cleaner air and stronger protections, how can we at Moms Clean Air Force and EcoMadres continue to center our advocacy on the communities most affected? What would be your advice to us?
First, I think it's really important, that you as an organization, and I think other national organizations understand the importance and the power of grassroots organizing, people to people organizing. Um, because the people that we serve, some of the hardest to reach people, they're not necessarily people who we're going to reach on social media, right? They're not necessarily going to be the people who are going to be able to come to a big in person function or gathering because they're working 3 jobs, but they are going to be available to have a cafecito in their home or in somebody's home, like on an evening, where they're going to talk about lots of other issues with their comadres, with their madrinas, with their, with their closest friends. So I would say that it's important for you to continue it. God, and I know this is your job, but I think it's important for you to continue to, meet the community where they are and to really think about that starting at a grassroots level. And then the other is like, we've just got to be working together. You have a different audience in some cases than we have. We have a different reach, and we have to use a multiplier effect so that we are exchanging information and resources, and then being each other's kind of cheerleaders. Like if you're not in the room, I need to be talking about your work and lifting it up and the connections, and vice versa. That's how we're going to do the justice work that needs to be done to reach as many people as possible. I think for a long time, movements have been siloed, and the reality is our work is connected to your work is connected to so many of the issues that we work on, and we've got to do the work of breaking down those silos. And so that's why I'm grateful to even be part of this conversation with you and to think about how we can collaborate. I think the other thing is like, in some ways when it comes to the environmental movement and even specifically work on climate, I think that there has been a sense that this has been a movement that is a white privileged movement, and that this is a movement that people can work on and in, when they are white and they are privileged. And there
Mhm.
hasn't been a lot of space for people in the movement, even in the organizations that are related to these issues, for people who are not white and privileged. And so I so appreciate EcoMadres because you're making that space. And just as much as addressing gender-based violence or worker exploitation are the movements of immigrant women in this country, immigrant people in this country, so should be the climate movement and the environmental movement. And I think the more work that we can do to make it clear that this movement doesn't belong to one demographic. It actually, it needs to belong to all of us, and we need to figure out the entry points. And so I just really so appreciate the work that you're doing to break those silos down and to bring folks like us in. And the more that we can bring the women on the ground in to really be the leaders sending the message, I think that will be even more important.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. You know, as I listen to you, it reminds me of something you said earlier, meet people where they're at, and that includes capacity. If people are barely getting through the day and they're concerned about, are their children going to be exposed to dangers as they leave, you know, by the end of the day, will they have experienced something awful? Meeting them where they're at for us may mean saying things like, if we're concerned about plastic pollution, which we are, that's a major thing we work on, maybe meeting people where they're at means, here's a way in which you can save money by not buying bottled water. It helps your family budget. We're not burdening them with taking action on plastics at a mega level, but helping families identify ways in which they can reduce plastic, help their family budget, helps us at the national level fight plastic pollution. I mean, there is just a simple example of how we can maybe think as an organization of meeting people where they're at, even in their daily lives, just getting through the day.
I agree with that. And I think the other thing is that, you know, my experience and sort of in my family and the work I've done for so many years is that when people think about people who are poor, they often, it's almost like this equivalency with, you know, poverty with like less educated. And that isn't true. That isn't always true.
No.
And but you know, so oftentimes people who are less advantaged, less privileged, you know, like they're always being told what they need to do, but they're not always being celebrated. And so I think the other opportunity here is, you know, when I go to the fields and I meet with people working in the fields, when I worked in the fields, we weren't taking bottles of water. We had big jarrones. We had big jarras of water, right? And like if you think about some of the immigrant families that we come from, you know, our families have always been conserving, reusing the butter container, you know, understanding that we need to stretch things as far as we can, like using glass instead of plastic. And so I would say the other piece of this is the communities that we come from and the people that we serve, they are knowing people. They are people
Yes.
who have already been engaging in these sustainability practices that we're now asking people to adopt. And I think that they need to be celebrated for that, because these are
That's a
traditions and
wonderful point. And it
practices.
goes back to your very early answer to how does spending time in the field make you aware of your environment. I think that's a wonderful point, and one that is the strength of rural life. Maybe in the cities we start losing that. Bueno, cambiemos a nuestro lenguaje, porque al fin y al cabo trabajamos con personas que hablamos español y ojalá portugués y muchos idiomas indígenas que yo desgraciadamente no hablo. Como activista latina, Mónica, ¿qué mensaje le gustaría darnos a nuestras ecomadres que luchamos por un aire más limpio y la necesidad de proteger a nuestra madre tierra? Si gusta, puede repetir algo que dijo en inglés, no importa, pero en honor a nuestras culturas, me gustaría que contestara en español.
Muchas gracias, Karin. Y mira, he hablado en español en este programa. A veces lo hablo bien, a veces no lo hablo bien, pero mira, así somos. You know, we're bilingual.
Eso.
Primero quiero agradecer a todas las madres que están tomando el tiempo para priorizar este tema, porque sé que están muy ocupadas, que tienen muchas responsabilidades y siempre han tomado el liderazgo en nuestra comunidad de asegurar que nuestras comunidades están saludables, sanas, etcétera. So, primeramente, gracias. Yo creo que es importante que como mujeres y como madres que seguimos este liderazgo en el sentido de que tenemos la responsabilidad de educar nuestras familias y nuestras compañeras, nuestras comunidades acerca de estos temas y a dónde están los recursos que nos pueden ayudar, cómo podemos involucrarnos en estos movimientos y cómo están relacionados a los diferentes movimientos, incluyendo este movimiento que tiene que ver con clima y el ambiente. Entonces, eso yo creo que es el tarea y es el tarea que están haciendo todos los días, pero yo creo que necesitamos hacer el trabajo para crear una red más grande y más fuerte que incluye este tema como parte de el trabajo que estamos haciendo para mejorar las condiciones para inmigrantes, para personas migrantes, etcétera. Y espero que podamos buscar las oportunidades de poder trabajar juntas para poder hacer este trabajo y cumplir con estas metas.
Sería un gran honor seguir colaborando. And by the way, Spanglish es un idioma totally accepted en EcoMadres.
Great.
So let me ask one last question, and thank you so much for joining us today. At Moms Clean Air Force and EcoMadres, we have a very important motto, which is justice in every breath. Justicia en cada respiro. What does that phrase mean to you?
It's beautiful. First of all, it's beautiful. You know, what it says to me is that from the moment we take our first breath, we should be entitled to justice. And through our lives until our last breath, we should be entitled to dignity and justice. And I think that is the work. That is what we're fighting for. And it's lifelong. It's year long. It's every day, and it's in every action. So I thank you so much for that beautiful saying, and I think it's something that I'm going to adopt now. You know, really thinking
Please
about
do.
the way that I frame my work. You know, because eso es la cosa. You know, from the time in terms of the work that I have done from childhood through adulthood, through aging, through death, we're fighting for the rights of the migrant people we serve, for them to have just lives and opportunities, and to be treated with dignity and respect. And we want that from the moment they take their first breath to the last one.
Thank you, Monica. That's a beautiful note on which to end. I cannot express enough how honored and pleased I am that we got to connect and that we get to feature your voice on our channel and our media. May our joint work continue. Reach out anytime. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias. Thank you. It's my honor.